So, Lars Iyer, thanks very much for joining us on Hermetics podcast.
Thank you.
We are going to be discussing your recently released book, My Vey, which is a sort of theory fiction novel. A, it's very difficult to describe, to be honest. It's a very strange novel. But as per the title, it sort of gravitates around this figure in the novel called Simone Weil and the philosophy of Simone Weil, and it also, just from my own reading of it, gravitates around what it is to be an academic and a philosopher in the modern day in a very typically British setting. And it's very funny, and it's full with care and love, and even though it's written in a sort of aphoristic, quite biting style, there are constantly these moments of vulnerability of what it is to really be passionate about the problems that we're faced with philosophers. And so, before we get into this, tell me a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why it is you decided to write My Vey.
James, I'm delighted you picked up on the care and the love and the vulnerability in the novel. Seems to me absolutely fundamental to it. That's what it's about. My background is in philosophy. I studied analytic philosophy, American style, Anglo style, British style, at the University of Manchester. And then I moved into continental philosophy, which I studied at the Manchester Metropolitan University, again in Manchester. And after that, I ended up teaching for many years philosophy here at Newcastle University. And then, eventually moved over to creative writing. Things weren't going that well for philosophy here at Newcastle, and it was a question of looking for somewhere to land, looking for somewhere where, I could just sustain living for a while because things look bleak. So I came to creative writing, and that's where I am now. After writing a series of novels, I got into novel writing out of the experience of blogging. As soon as I got a permanent job here at Newcastle in philosophy, I thought I really have now to try to put into practice some of the things I admire about the philosophies of, well, think of a thinker like Maurice Blanchot. I thought, okay, I want now not just to write academic prose, but to try and write a literary philosophical prose, a literary prose which would be philosophical in many ways. And I turned to blogging, which was just in its infancy at that point. This is the early days of blogging. I thought, here's the perfect medium. And what happened was, after a few years of my Blanchotian attempts to write, I found that people thought these blogs I was writing, these posts I was writing, were ridiculous, and they were laughing at me and taking the piss. And what they enjoyed was those elements of the blog where I took the piss out of myself, where I laughed at myself, where I laughed at my pretensions, where I laughed at what it was I was trying to do. And this is a very British reaction to European philosophy, to continental philosophy. And here in the UK, we're very suspicious of anything which smacks of pretension,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something which I have in myself as well. I've thoroughly internalized this, so I also find myself when I try to think philosophically, I find myself somewhat ridiculous. I began writing posts about this, and these eventually turned into my first novel, Spurious, which was published by the Melville House, who kept an eye in those days, and I suppose still now as well, on the blogging scene. So Melville House kept an eye out, looked to see what was going on. When I approached them with my novel, they knew who I was. They knew my work. And on from there, I did three novels, which are based on some of the material I was writing at the blog. Writing this material was basically self-deprecating, looking at the conditions of philosophy in the UK, celebrating some of those departments in the UK, departments of continental philosophy, which were facing closure or had been closed. So his first three novels of mine were hymns of praise to what continental philosophy once was in the UK, and the struggles that many of these departments have been through, that many of my friends and colleagues have been through, losing jobs, becoming redundant at the age of 45. So I wanted to celebrate that world, which was rapidly passing away when I published the first three novels.
I think there's something in the British character that can't just own pretentiousness. The French can do it. The Germans have their own way of doing it, but British people we can't do it. So you've taken the other tact and just said, yeah, this is all somewhat ridiculous. Let's take the piss out of it.
And yet at the same time, I greatly admire seriousness. It's something we do very well in popular music here in the UK. And some of the music I celebrate in my vein is the great Mancunian music of Joy Division and New Order, the music of The Fall, the music of the Smiths. And this is music I celebrate because it is full of seriousness, particularly Joy Division. Utter seriousness. It seems that in the UK, what we're able to tolerate is high modernism, European thinking, the art film in general, as it's mediated to us through popular music.
Mm.
So popular music is that place where we're allowed to be, as it were, pretentious, where it is we're allowed to be serious. Because on the one hand, I would say that my work is always comic, but on the other hand, it's always admiring my work of seriousness, of passion, of commitment, of intensity, of ideas, of thinking. These are things I immensely admire and admired as I was growing up when I first encountered some of these philosophical ideas through the music of these great bands, these great acts that I admired growing up.
Mm. Just a tangential question off from that, because there's something that just comes to mind, because in your book, in terms of the fact, I mean, I can't show the cover because this is just the reader's copy, but I will just say, oh, hang on, let's. Okay, there we go. Yeah, but you can see from that cover, from those, what struck me about it really, for those of you that are from the UK, is the usage of a double-decker bus. And I mean, this is almost an archetypal British experience for anyone who's lived in the UK or has come to the UK, the sort of palpable dusty misery of a bus. And there is this we could say the geography of your book is a Mancunian sort of, well, to be honest, this is cookie cutter pasted all over the UK now. Every city is pretty much the same, but this sort of palpable rainy day misery, and the bus, I think, personifies that. And just the question from what you said about this pretentiousness and there's something very British about your book is, in terms of what we take seriously, you said interestingly that we take pop seriously. It's sort of a mystery to me that Britain never had a Chiron or a Bernhard or a Celine. Britain never got a misery writer. And do you think that's just because we just have this misery anyway? So to actually, I don't know, sort of explicitly write it down, you say that's too pretentious, that's too much, we can't deal with it. We have to ride this bus every day. Just drawing on your book, but I just found that the river flowing through your book, if you want to put it that way, is that hospital waiting room misery of being British, which builds character, I think.
Yeah, so this idea of waiting for buses, waiting on a bus to get to your destination, or waiting for that matter in a hospital room. This idea of waiting is something which I comically map onto the famous notion from Simone Weil of waiting. So when the characters discuss waiting, which is an idea which comes from out of a French philosophical milieu, they're doing so in a very British location. They're doing so on the bus. And my characters resent being passengers on the bus. To be a passenger is to be passive. You're almost a victim of the bus. You've got to wait for the bus. And when you get on the bus, you're trapped in some queue. It takes ages to get your destination. It's a very prosaic environment. And this idea of the prosaic, the idea of the comic, are very strongly linked for me. In the UK, I think what we do quite well, again, is comedy. In a lot of our popular culture, in film, in television, what we're very good at is pathetic comedy. Comedy about disappointment, comedy about the humdrum, the dreary, the mediocre. What makes up our lives? Waiting around, going to meetings, sitting in a waiting room, waiting at the bus stop. You're sitting there in a queue somewhere. There's a lot of this sort of waiting around. And this is what I wanted in my fiction to use as a way of trying to think through what might appear to be much more lofty ideas which were produced in a French context. And for your international listeners and viewers, in the UK, France is a world apart from what we have over here. We can barely believe that. I can barely believe that France exists. My characters cannot believe that Paris exists. It's this wonderland of ideas this world in which it's possible to have a university job and not be totally engulfed in administration and meetings and bureaucracy. It's a place where ideas are valued, where there are peak time television programs about philosophical ideas, where if you go to a bookshop, and most of the bookshops remain independent in France, apparently, if you go to a bookshop, on the stands, you'll see philosophical work being displayed prominently, where philosophy is taught to sixth formers at school, the equivalent of sixth formers in France, where philosophy is very much part of the general intellectual discourse. Well, my characters are in the UK. My characters are on a bus. My characters are doing work in which no one's interested, which has no purchase whatsoever in British culture. So what they're doing is something which appears to them to be not even anachronistic, because there never really was a time which you could study this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So what do they have? What consolation do they have? Comedy. Mm-hmm. Taking the piss out of themselves as being potentially pretentious, taking the piss out of each other, laughing at each other, and in this way they stand in the line of a British comic tradition, which goes right back to music hall.
What was it Deleuze said about when you were mentioning that notion of British people couldn't even imagine that France exists? I think Deleuze said something along the line of, Britain or the UK could never be a philosophical nation because it's an island. And your book is very much the you feel, okay, we're trapped. We're in this place which is cornered off. There is something else out there, but we don't get to have that right now. And it's very administrative in that way. But just to really open this up, because when it comes to philosophical discussion, there's sort of these multitude of types, and your book is amidst many in a way. So you have philosophy proper, then maybe you have academic papers, then you have poetry, which is a whole other thing, and you now, more recently though, you could probably find examples of it throughout history, you have what's being called theory fiction, which is what I would put your novel into, and of course your other works on Wittgenstein and Nietzsche. What is it that theory fiction can do for philosophy that those other types can't?
Yeah, it's for others to say, really. It's one of these things you can't say. You can't speak in of your own work in this way. If I think of philosophy and fiction, I think of Plato straight away. I think of Plato. In Plato's work, of course, Socrates is a character, a literary character, as he was in the work of Xenophon. So Socrates is a character in the works of these Greek writers. And what we see in these great books by Plato is Socrates engaged in discussion. Socrates in the marketplace, talking to whoever he might meet. Socrates in more formal settings, Socrates surrounded by acolytes, by admirers, and refusing their praise, ironically, refusing to settle into a figure who can be taken for granted. So for me, when I think of philosophy and fiction, it's of Plato, I think, it's of Kierkegaard, I think, and the great works of Kierkegaard, where some of his works are themselves written by fictional characters that Kierkegaard created. Some of his work stages dialogues between different characters that Kierkegaard created. So this is the background to my work. It would be, for me, I'm thinking of Plato, I'm thinking of Kierkegaard's work. It's this kind of thing where ideas can be discussed. Now, one big difference between my work and the work of other thinkers, people writing particularly in the continent, is, as we've discussed already, this is taking place in a country which is more or less indifferent to European ideas. Now, of course, we have our own indigenous philosophizing tradition over here in the UK. That's very important not to neglect. But to European ideas, we don't really feel hospitable, in the way that we might do to some of our indigenous ideas or some of the ideas which come out of America. So these novels are written after a moment in which philosophy could be taken seriously in a world in which philosophy was taken seriously. So that's why they're often very farcical. They're full of humor. This humor is this comic art reflects the character's own self-suspicion, their own worry about pretentiousness. But there are moments in this novel, I think there are about 5 of them, where the characters do engage in something like a philosophical discussion, a serious philosophical discussion. I say there's about 5 of these set pieces One's in a well, both two of them actually in a restaurant in Manchester, different restaurants. And the idea was to try and recreate a sense of intellectual life, showing a kind of intensity that breaks through the comedy. Because one of the things I'm very keen to do in this work of fiction is to try to break through that comedy, break through the laughter, break through the fears of pretension, to try and present something real. I'm using the word real here in a manner which Simone Weil herself, the philosopher, might recognize. But what reality refers to is the reality of suffering people, the reality of those who are afflicted, the reality of those whose lives are absolutely miserable. And one of the questions of the novel is, how do we attest to this suffering? How can we witness this suffering? How can we then act upon the call that is made upon us because of this suffering? So I wanted to break through humor, comedy, bathos. I wanted to break through fears of pretentiousness by having my characters, and in particular the narrator, Johnny, having my characters heed this call from without, this call from the suffering other person.
Did you have any direct, like immediate British comedic inspirations?
Well, these things I think you absorb just by existing in the UK. Mm-hmm. I've never really watched very much comedy, oddly enough. It's not a genre which interests me. I buy this stuff from Oxfam on DVD. I watch a little bit of it. I'm just no interest. I think it's because this is the medium in which I live. Mm-hmm. This is just life to me. Mm-hmm. So I don't really feel any need to acknowledge any predecessors in comedy. It's not a genre in which I'm particularly interested. I don't watch much of it. I mean, growing up, Derek and Clive.
I was going to say there was a bit. I felt there was a bit of Derek and Clive in your book.
Yeah, I mean, this is when I was a teenager. I never listened to it since. Things like Monty Python, Spike Milligan. I watched when I was young, and when I was little, with a good friend of mine, we used to make these comedy tapes. We do our own sketches. When I was a child, they're kind of funny. My friend, he's kept a lot of these things, and they're pretty entertaining. A lot of these, absolutely filthy, but they're amusing. So this comedy is just the world in which we live. In the UK, if I get together with friends who share my sense of humor, then this is how we talk. I mean, it's totally natural to us. The comedy is not an effort to access. It's an effort to shape to make it part of a narrative. But it's just something which I think we take for granted over here. If we're from a certain background, perhaps a certain class, I'm not sure what it is, then it's just what we do when we get together. We take the piss out of each other.
We do. It's interesting when I've spoken to American friends and they've come to the UK for the first time. One of the things I've heard a few times is, why do British people try and make a joke out of everything? And a lot of our humour, because some people will mistake. I remember when I worked as a carpenter, and some of the jokes that we would make to each other, the typical 8 a.m. Monday morning, absolutely, tired as hell, and have that sort of boisterous British, what we might call banter, but what we call banter, and somehow understand on an intuitive level, to other people would be borderline an insult, or genuinely just an insult. I can't really repeat many of the jokes that we would make to each other because I'm not really sure how, outside of the Britishness, you wouldn't say that's not a joke at all. You just told him to, I don't know. Well, I won't repeat it on the podcast. But one interesting thing you said there is about how you have these set pieces of intellectual life. Now, the notion that you have these set pieces of intellectual life which are taking place in a restaurant or taking place in just waiting room conversations, it's interesting because the hotbed, if you want to put it that way, in which you're another sort of place that your whole book is taking part within, is academia. And the irony is, we should, in a working world, we would say that academia is the place for intellectual discussion. But the fact that your book is amidst academia, and all the time, you have these sort of gripes with the business studies students, and really there's just this bureaucratic, administrative feel to it. And the fact that the intellectual life that should be in academia has to take place within restaurants or within these spontaneous moments, sort of slowly reveals what has happened and what academia is. So that's another question for you, because academia is almost a character in this book. What is academia to you now?
Sure. I mean, academia in general has been taken over by management ideologies, management ideas, which are produced in the 90s, the 2000s. I actually spent a lot of time reading this stuff reading the management books when I was writing my previous novel, Nietzsche and the Burbs. Spent a lot of time reading management theory out of great interest. And a lot of the phrases that come up in management theory were adopted, they were used in academia initially with a sense of irony. So back in the 90s, people would use these terms and they'd sort of wink or smile or put them in figurative quotation marks. But, we've at least 25 years where these terms like best practice are used by academics without any irony or distance. All these managerial terms, these managerial ideas have been completely embedded in academia. So academia has become just a branch of business studies in that sense. Now, there are discussions between people which might be about ideas, which might be passionate. They tend to take place on the margins of academia, in para-academic spaces, in spaces which aren't quite academic. So for me, some of the great discussions which I witnessed was back in the blogging days.
Mm-hmm.
It's people like Levi Bryant. In those days, he blogged as Larval Subjects, and he went under the name of Synthome. And you see the quality of some of the discussions he was having with his interlocutors. It was absolutely marvelous. Back in those days, in the early 2000s, I worked at a university, but at that time, I couldn't find anyone who was actually really excited by, who felt passionate about literature. In the blogging world, I came across bloggers like Stephen Mitchellmore, and there was passion about literature. That was really exciting to see, about literary writing. I couldn't see it in the world around me in academia. In academia, if you go to academic dinner parties, people are talking like everyone else. They're talking about box sets. They're talking about TV series of various kinds. It's very rare you find people who are interested in talking about books. Now, things have changed for me. I work in creative writing, and people are very passionate about literature and creative writing. So creative writing people are a breed apart. But in general, in academia, things are not only business oriented, they're not only focused on television series, this kind of thing. They're also, academics are very serious. There's lack of humor. There's no humor. There's no laughter. There's lots of just graveness and heaviness. There's not much fun to be had. There's no one to roll your eyes with at meetings. There's no one to turn to in a spirit of camaraderie and to raise your eyebrows at a particular statement which comes up. There's nothing like that. And we tend to work in a solitary way, sitting in our offices, very, very busy with 1 billion emails a day, with all these directives coming down from management. There's not much time to have fun. So my way actually is almost nostalgic for a time in which there was, I'm thinking of my own period as a PhD student, for a time in which you could talk about things. You could talk about serious intellectual matters. Mm. So that's something which is missing, both the seriousness of talking about academic matters and also the comedy that should be directed at the business practices that the university is saturated with.
So why Weil then? Why Simone Weil?
Simone Weil is one of these thinkers, alongside two other thinkers I've written about in the last 3 novels that I published. One was Wittgenstein, one was Nietzsche, and now we have Simone Weil. And these are thinkers who existed in a very uncomfortable relationship with the university, on the margins of the university. And often, in the case of Maivai, in the case of Nietzsche left the university behind. So these are thinkers who try and find a place in which they can think. And not only that, a place in which they can live in accordance with their thoughts. So these are thinkers for whom philosophy in general is something akin to what Pierre Hadot called, in his very important study of ancient Greek thinkers, a spiritual practice, where philosophy is a practice of living, not merely a body of thoughts. So all these 3 thinkers in different ways allow us to question what the university is, what education is. And that's what I've done in this trilogy. All 3 volumes are an attempt to rethink what education might be, what study might be, what it means to learn something, what it means to learn with someone who's much higher up than you philosophically, who's much more able than you are. So all 3 books are about these characters who come into contact with a lofty and important figure who seems almost a reincarnation of a figure from the past. All 3 novels are set in the present. All 3 novels are set in the UK. In Wittgenstein Jr., the characters are in their early 20s. In Nietzsche and the Burbs, the characters are in their teens. In Maivai, the characters are in their mid-20s. These are young characters coming into contact with characters who are versions of these important, lofty European-style thinkers who embody high seriousness, who embody philosophical integrity in the way not only that they think, but in the way in which they live their lives.
Do you think those characters are successful in actually transmuting that seriousness across to British people? Do you think?
Well, the characters around them are comedic characters. So Wittgenstein Jr., the characters around Wittgenstein are always fooling around. They're always drunk. They're always laughing at philosophical ideas. But at the same time, the seriousness of my character Wittgenstein reaches them, and they venerate him. They regard him very highly. And my character Wittgenstein comes to regard them highly too. My character Wittgenstein comes to love them in their very foolishness, in their irreverence. And my character Wittgenstein, and that's the drama of that particular novel, turns to my characters for a sense of relief. For Wittgenstein, what my characters seem to show him is a possibility of a world after philosophy, after the great philosophical work has been done. A world which is almost like the Messianic kingdom, where people are allowed to be light and frivolous and fun.
Mm-hmm. So what is the in my Vey? What is the characters? What would you say is the characters' reactions to Vey?
So my character Simone Vey, comes from a mysterious background. We don't know much about her in the novel. She's got a scholarship. She's won a scholarship. She's come to their university. So their university has been giving out scholarships on a program of study which is called disaster studies. And we learn in the novel that disaster studies is an attempt for a philosophy department to rebrand itself in order to attract students to impress university management. So disaster studies is what philosophy is called at this university. And various students have come to study disaster studies on a scholarship to do their PhDs. So this is a great opportunity. It's very hard to get funding to do PhDs. And my characters are unusual in that they are mostly working class. They are ethnically not British in origin, generally speaking. So these are people who are not the standard kind of person who goes to study philosophy and who ends up teaching philosophy. Philosophy is generally undiverse as a subject area. And in terms of class, it's very rare to get working class thinkers teaching in academia. And that's the background from which my characters come. Into their midst arrives Simone Vey, and my characters are naturally inclined to be skeptical, to laugh. But like the characters in my previous two novels, they become impressed by her seriousness. And even though they joke about it, her example is one which impresses them. And in particular, it impresses my lead character, my protagonist, Johnny. And Johnny, during the novel, begins to fall in love with Simone Vey. Simone Vey embodies something which he feels is missing in his life. A sense of meaning. That's what he's looking for. Johnny, my character, is looking for meaning, a sense of belonging. My characters are very eloquent on the subject of their despair. They talk about their despair constantly. And they draw on philosophical traditions of writing about suffering and misery and unhappiness. And one of the resources they draw upon is Gnosticism. So my characters are actually named after Gnostics. Valentine, Marcia, named after some of these famous Gnostics. Gnostics lived around the period of 200 years before the birth of Jesus and about 300 years after. And it's regarded by the Christians of that period as a range of heresies. And one of the things that's most striking about Gnosticism is they regard our world, the world in which we live, as being evil and fallen. This is a disgusting world which horrifies the Gnostics. And what they do instead of trying to belong to this world is turn to the genuine God, the real God. Now, the real God is someone who cannot communicate with us directly. The real God is outside of this world. Our world is ruled by a malevolent God of a lower level, the demiurge. And the demiurge is in charge of this world in which we live, which is, as Philip K. Dick called it in some of his Gnostic writings, this black iron prison. So my characters believe themselves to be living in this prison. Our world is a prison world. Our world is a world which can only lead to despair. And for that reason, what my characters look towards is something which might come from without, perhaps a burst of transcendence, an opening within nihilism, some opening within nihilism where nihilism seems to overlap in some sense with a religious dimension. And for this reason, because they come from Gnosticism, they find certain resonances with respect to their own ideas in the work of the character who appears amongst them, Simone Weil. So Simone Weil's writings can seem on a superficial reading, and my character can be very superficial. Simone Weil's writings can seem on a superficial reading to also express this world disgust and world horror. But as the novel goes on, what we learn is that far from expressing a Gnostic view, what my character Simone Weil wants to express is something much more surprising. It's a sense of love for the order of the world as it is, despite all its imperfections. What my character Simone Weil espouses, like her original, the real Simone Weil, is a love of fate, a love of this world, a love of the order of this world. And what my character Simone Weil tries to do is to lift my characters out of their misery, out of their perception that life is terrible. And in particular, she wants to do this with Johnny. And that, for me, is the most important scene in the novel. It's a scene where Simone and Johnny are sitting in the garden, and Johnny is declaring his love to Simone. And Simone is trying to save Johnny and try to show him that his worldview, that his view of the world as being bleak and terrible, is utterly at fault. What she's trying to do is to help him. And this is one of these scenes about education, which are frequent in my fiction. He's trying to help him see that he's got it wrong about the world. So Simone Weil, in that sense, in my novel, is trying to bring this message of hope, of meaning, of order to my characters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you okay if I talk about spoilers?
Of course, please do.
Well, yeah, okay. So from that, this sort of trying to alter his worldview or try to change Johnny's worldview to say, look, you've seen this all wrong, with Weil acting as sort of the divine spark, smuggled in by Sophia in the Gnostic sense. This, to a certain extent, this seems all very noble, but right near the end of the novel, spoiler alert, Weil gets stabbed. So
yeah,
there is a question of, well, who is still correct in this sense, and this notion of Simone Weil, or the character of Simone Weil getting stabbed, is really it's not because she's such an innocent image without trying to seem stereotypical and sort of coy. I mean, the notion of her getting stabbed is almost like in a Heideggerian sense, like throwing Simone Weil into what is kind of reminds me of the novel Lanark by Alistair Gray, of, like Manchester has become this sort of level of hell, or maybe even a purgatory, and there is this atmosphere of apocalypticism throughout your book, this call to the Centre for Disaster Studies as well, throwing Weil into that world. And it really, I guess the question for me is, maybe one of success as to whether or not, after this stabbing, any notion of Weil's care for the world has really taken root.
So this is a novel in which Simone Weil's ideas are discussed, in which Simone's vision of life is something discussed as well. But I don't want to endorse Simone Weil's arguments at all. It's these three novels I've just written about philosophers who are very, very far from my concerns. I don't believe in this idea of cosmic order, in Simone Weil's sense, and that puts a complete barrier between me and her work. So for me, Simone Weil is a figure who's I love her work. I love reading it, but it's very remote from my sense of how things are. So I don't regard her work as being relevant. I find Simone Weil herself is a curiously death-haunted figure. Now, in the novel, Simone Weil, my character, is a PhD student, but she also volunteers in a direct action charity, and these charities actually do exist. I've known people involved in them, and these charities are about giving immediate alleviation to people who live on the streets, to people who are homeless. So you go straight out on the streets and you're bringing people money, you're bringing people food, you're giving them something there and then, without any mediation, without requiring them to go to a homeless shelter. So this is an immediate form of charity, which of course is immensely risky. So Simone Weil in the novel tells us that she goes among the poor, that she tries to listen to them, to heed them. That, above all, is so crucial to her. What Simone Weil in the novel tries to do is to give time and space to heed the other, to heed these poor, suffering people, to spend time with them in order to listen to them, to listen to their testimony, to listen to their sense of what it means to be afflicted, and to then try to give them whatever help she can. So that's crucial for me, that this Simone is someone who is out there in the world exposing herself to these dangers. But at the same time, Manchester, the Manchester of the novel, is a terribly grim and risky place, and that inevitably what's going to happen to her is something violent and unpleasant. So, we know it's going to happen. It has to happen. It's something which is foreshadowed throughout the novel. We know that she's not going to meet a happy end in that sense. So, yes, indeed, Simone gets stabbed, as of course she would on the street. She's dealing with people with severe mental illnesses and addictions and all kinds of problems. So, in one sense, you could say what Simone's doing is naivety itself. Is total foolishness. Is totally quixotic. The idea that you can just go onto the streets, give people some money, give people some food, listen to people, and thereby solve their problems. Instead of doing something much more practical, like leading people into a centre, like constructing suitable housing for people, like helping keep people come off their drugs and alcohol addiction. So in that sense, Simone Weil is presented as a figure who's wildly delusional and at the same time wildly admirable in her charitable work. And here in the novel, one of the things I wanted to do is to celebrate the life of a friend of mine now dead, who is embodied in the character called Michael. He's a good friend of mine, and I lived in his house, like my character Johnny lived in Michael's house in the novel. And my good friend David used to bring people into the house who were street drinkers, addicts, and try to give them a place to live, away from their former associates, away from the streets, and just try to give them some sort of comfort, some sort of security, a few weeks of peace. And I greatly admired this act of very practical and very risky charity. So I wanted to bring that to life in my fiction, that sense in which you can try and do these things. It might be naive, it might be foolish, but it's also in another sense wonderful, impressive, marvelous.
But it's marvelous, but over a certain span of time, eventually it becomes sort of transparently ridiculous.
It can do. Now, this is the thing. I mean, what I heard people saying, people who are friends of us in the house, they'd say, you're stopping people reaching rock bottom. You're stopping people really reaching that point at which they then turn for help to institutions like for Drugs Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, these sorts of groups. So what you're doing is actually forestalling, you're delaying that moment in which someone will say, I simply cannot go on. And that was the criticism leveled at the house in general. By taking people in who were alcoholics, who were drug addicts, you're simply just delaying that moment in which they might confront their situation and do something about it. At the same time, this is the other thing, look, even people who go along to AA or NA, they often lapse back into former habits, and the rates of recovery are not always encouraging. So to give a few weeks to someone, to give maybe a year to someone in such an environment, isn't that at least something?
What was your opinion after leaving that household of I mean, I guess it's a broader question of just the success of whether or not this sort of modern nihilism can be overcome by care. I mean, what is your opinion of whether or not that can be successful, or is it sort of still quite vague for you after having that personal experience of that household?
No, I thought it was a wonderful thing to give people a sense of home.
But was it success? But was it? I mean, it's a wonderful thing. I don't think anyone would deny that that sort of St. Francis outlook of going towards poverty is a wonderful thing. But that doesn't make it successful or practical.
It depends on the measure. It depends on the measure of what you deem to be. What is the criterion which defines success? Does it mean lasting sobriety? Does it mean being able to go back into the world and do a job or form relationships with other people which are positive? In that sense, maybe not. Maybe it's just it's an oasis in the desert. It's something you stop for a while, then you move on. There are people who came out of the house and they did well with their lives, but often they were people who had to go through this terrible dark night on their own, and eventually come to that moment where they turned their lives around. So this was possible. But yes, I still admire this impractical, wild, foolish, crazy way of taking people in, just taking people in who were needful. I was one of these people. I mean, I didn't have any problems with drugs or alcohol. I had a problem with being burgled over and over again and having all kinds of problems with my housing. I remember moving 3 times in about 3 months and having all kinds of issues with living in very grim areas, people breaking in. So I felt very fortunate to find this house in which to live and spend some years in peace and tranquility. So there are people like me as well who just need somewhere to be, So I felt extremely grateful for that, and I always wanted to pay tribute to my good friend David, who died back in the early 2000s, and that was part of this novel is to pay tribute to him, to say what he did in providing people with a home was a very important thing.
So, what do you think that says of the love that's running throughout the novel? Do you think that it reveals it in all its vulnerability and all its, not to be too crass, but it's often its stupidity. Like, it's sort of the decisions Vey is making. If you were to hear them, you go, to be honest, it's a silly decision these days. But there is no way if you were to try be more pragmatic about the decision, you would no longer be loving. It would once again fall into this sort of academic, administrative thing that we've been talking about, and love can't be taken into that. It can't be subsumed into the.
Yeah, I think here of well, first of all, Simone Weil herself says, the call of the afflicted other is something you cannot think about theoretically. You feel it. Rather than that, you actually hear it. It's something you hear. You hear the call of the other, and it's something which you can't intellectualize. But I also think here of the great contemporary thinker, one of the best philosophers of recent times, Ivan Illich. Now, Ivan Illich is a figure who's long fascinated me. And what always interested me was the transcription of his last interviews, where Ivan Illich, who was himself originally as a priest, he was a missionary, he trained missionaries in South America, where Illich at last talks about religion, talks about faith, talks about the Bible. Now, Illich had been excommunicated because of his the way he was teaching missionaries was regarded as being very heretical, and he was cut off from the church. And he always said, our deference to the church, he still admired the church in many ways, our deference to it. I won't speak about the church ever. I won't criticize it. But very late on, he gave a series of interviews as he was dying in which he actually discusses his relationship to Christianity. And one of the things he mentions there, one of the things he retells is the story of the Good Samaritan. And what he says about the Good Samaritan is the Samaritan is the one who's able to respond to the beaten person, the person who's afflicted by the side of the road. And that is a response which Illich emphasizes occurs in the guts. It's something which occurs in the heart of the human being. And by responding to this other, who is not of the same background ethnically as a Samaritan, by responding to the other in a way which cuts across these ethnic backgrounds, these religious backgrounds, what we find is a new model for friendship, for relationships between people, for a relationship of love, of agape, where you love the other no matter who the other is. It's an incredible moment, according to Illich, when he talks about this moment in the Gospels when Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor? And when Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor? The neighbor is anybody suffering, anybody injured, anyone lying by the side of the road, no matter whether or not you are ethnically linked to them, they become your neighbor. So Illich argues that this is a primordial moment. This is the best thing about humanity, is that we are able to respond in this way and act in this way. But he also argues that once you get institutionalized religion, once you even get hospitals to help look after the injured, then you've corrupted the best. The best becomes the worst. Once you have any kind of institution that mediates between you and your neighbor, then you've lost the primordiality of that relationship. So Illich is very famous for his critique of different institutions, educational institutions in particular, but also governmental institutions which concern energy and water. And what he does in his last interviews, Illich says, it all actually is based on the church originally. It's the church. That's at the heart of my thought. It's about the corruption of the church when the best turns into the worst. So the best of humanity is, as you say earlier, that St. Francis-like abandonment. It's what we find in the figure of Jesus, the foolishness of Jesus. It's what we find in the figure of the holy idiot, particularly in Orthodoxy. The holy idiot is someone who tries to live the life of Jesus in the apparent foolishness of Jesus's life. So that's the idea. You're living the life of a fool who, by any normal reckoning, is simply doing something stupid. So there is a profound stupidity to the Samaritan. There's a profound stupidity in helping the other in the way that Simone Weil herself advocated helping the other.
So I was going to ask there about whether this notion of the call to the other occurs in the guts, occurs in the heart. You hear it, and how that's dampened. How what it is that deafens that, being able to hear that. But it seems that what deafens that is, in abstract, the institution, whether in the Illich sense it's the institution of the church, or if it's the academic institution that says here's how to be ethical, A, B, and C. And so from that is the question of to overcome what many consider to be, whether or not we agree with it or not, the supposed nihilism of the modern world isn't something that can be structured. It has to be, you know what, I'm just going to be a fool. There's my meaning. I'm going to be an absolute fool for it. I don't care. I'm not going to... To me personally, it seems like a complete ignorance. There's my meaning. I'm going to be a fool for it. I'm not going to listen to someone who says don't go down that road because you might get stabbed. Right? That's quite literally what you would have to ignore. But to overcome nihilism in the sense of Weil within this book is just going to be the fool.
Yeah. So that's the idea. There's a sense in which meaning is absent. This is something which seems to occur as a notion of nihilism appears in the 19th century, and it seems to be linked to the idea of disenchantment. The world is no longer the world is something which can be explained scientifically using scientific laws, and the capacity of science to predict what the world will do and to explain what the world is seems to be incredibly powerful, unimpeachably powerful. And it seems to leave little room then for what a human being might be. We get in Dostoevsky's work in Notes from Underground, a character who, what Dostoevsky wants us to do as we read this character, is to work out for ourselves the sense in which determinism, this idea of determinism, something which is pure nihilism. And Dostoevsky wants to say there is still nevertheless a freedom, even in this character. And in Nietzsche's thought, what we try and find, what Nietzsche tries to give us is a sense in which, okay, so science can explain everything, can explain the whole world, and maybe we're not free at all. There's nevertheless some degree of freedom in the way in which we might affirm everything that's happened to us. So this power of affirmation in Nietzsche is the idea in which we can say yes to the world. We say yes, even though things might be thoroughly determined. We have the freedom to accede, to consent to the world as it is, and even more than that for Nietzsche, that we can will that everything that's happened could happen again in exactly the same way. This is the famous, for me, I think of it as a spiritual exercise in the sense in which Pierre Hadot identifies this famous moment of the eternal return of the same. But what you're doing is affirming the world exactly as it is. Now, in contrast to this idea, I would put what we find in Jewish philosophy, in the philosophy of Jewish thinkers from the early 20th century, Rosenzweig, Scholem, but also in Jewish writers like Kafka. And that's the sense in which nihilism has some secrets. And indeed, nihilism might be quite close to religion in various ways. That nihilism is valuable in that what it does, it disenchants our relationship to the world around us. It means we're no longer subject to the world. We're no longer enthralled to the world. We're no longer sitting there thinking, oh, the world's a wonderful gift and the world in and of itself is good. So these thinkers, they draw nihilism close to this idea of religion. And many of the thinkers that come out of this movement, and I'm thinking in the end, of Emmanuel Levinas, they say the way out of nihilism is in the relationship to the other, to the human other. And that's what breaks our love of the world. So I want to make that contrast really clear. What we get in response to nihilism is a Nietzschean attempt to justify the world as it is, for us to affirm the world as it is. I wrote about this in my novel Nietzsche and the Burbs in some detail. And then in Jewish modernity, there's a sense in which we have to break from the world. And the only way we can do this is by opening up this nihilism, opening up this void. And the reason I was drawn to Simone Weil is Simone Weil is so similar to these thinkers. And these thinkers are, for me, this is my home in philosophy. This is where I live philosophically, is with these Jewish modernist thinkers. Simone Weil is close to them, similar to them in some ways. But what she tries to do is to bring back a positive sense of God, a positive sense of meaning from this nihilism. And that's why Simone Weil became a really fascinating figure for me. I thought I really want to work on her. I want to work with her writing. I want to see how she does this and whether she can be successful.
Where do you go from there?
From Simone Weil's thoughts, that's the question. Well, I want now to really bring into dialogue this Nietzschean, I also call it Bataillean, Deleuzian account of the attempt to work with just the world as it is, naturalism, you can call it, to bring that into dialogue with this Jewish tradition. So try and do that. So my novels, Nietzsche and the Burbs, presents a Nietzschean view where we see a character trying to undertake this eternal return, and here's a spoiler, failing. And in the Simone Weil novel, we find Simone Weil trying to live the life of a fool for Christ, a fool for Jesus, and again failing. So I want to. There's actually an implicit dialogue between the two novels, which is about the nature of compassion, because of course Nietzsche was very, very suspicious of compassion as an idea. He worried about pity. He thought that what pity does is to make us hate the world, dislike the world, to worship suffering. So there's a dialogue between the two novels. I want to make this more explicit in my next novel. What I want to do is to actually present these two views and bring them into a much more explicit dialogue, because these are views in which this is a dialogue in which I feel myself very much caught up. Although I feel the philosophy of Jewish modernity to be a philosophical home for me. It's one which I don't really understand. If I'm going to try and understand it, I have to test it and work against it and try and find counterexamples. So that's what my attempt will be in my next novel.
Is there anything you'd like to add about My Way, which you feel we've skipped over, or is key that you'd like to add in?
I think we've covered almost everything. The fact that it's comic, the fact that it presumes no philosophical background whatsoever might be important, that anyone can read this. This is deliberately written, so it's understandable by anybody. It presumes no philosophical background. So it's comic, it's open to any reader. But I think above all, for me, it's supposed to be emotional, it's supposed to connect with people emotionally. My hope is it's very, very moving. And that my hope is that when you put it down, you feel profoundly moved. That this is not just about intellectual ideas. It's not about philosophy as a theoretical enterprise. It's about the nature of suffering. It's about how we might respond to people who suffer around us and to our own suffering, how we can respond to the felt lack of meaning. So what I hope to have been able to do is to draw my reader into this debate. It's more than a debate. Draw my reader into a sense of what horror might feel like. Draw my reader into a sense of what it might mean to long for something other than horror. So that's the hope for me. This book works affectively. It works by emotion. It works by making people feel the situation in which these characters are in, and in particular in the character Johnny. My hope is that my readers will fall in love with this character, and that's my hope. He's an appealing character who says something that we all want in some way. I talked about this idea of a home. That's what Johnny wants. He wants a place to be with me, which has meaning, a place to be where he can just rest and live and take a breath and be calm. So that's my hope, that my readers will be moved by Johnny and perhaps see something of themselves in Johnny.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good place to finish up, and it's a good way to draw people into the book. So I will put links for My Way in the description below, and a big thank you to the publisher for sending me an advanced copy. But I feel, we've covered everything, and unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I feel it's a good place to finish up.
Thanks, James. That was fantastic. Thank you all.
Thank you.